Julian Cross decided who mattered in a room within seconds, and the woman everyone ignored was the first person he noticed. Her name, he would learn later, was Clara Whitmore. She stood alone near the far end of the reception, unclaimed by conversation, untouched by attention, while men worth billions spoke in low, assured voices around her. Julian had just stepped inside, jacket removed, posture relaxed, expression unreadable, when his instincts flagged her absence from the social equation. Rooms like this followed rules. Clara was breaking one by existing quietly without permission. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Julian Cross had built his life on leverage. Not noise. Not reputation. Influence that moved without leaving fingerprints. His portfolio stretched across private equity, global logistics, and security holdings that never appeared in public reports. He attended events like this not to be impressed, but to remind others where the lines were drawn. This one was no different. The venue was private, controlled, designed for discretion. No grand displays. No obvious luxury. Just carefully curated comfort for people who understood restraint as status. Julian registered it all automatically, then dismissed it. His attention had already shifted back to Clara. She had arrived earlier than him, alone. Clara Whitmore hadn't expected to feel invisible, but she recognized the sensation immediately. It wasn't hostility. It was worse, indifference. People passed her without pause, conversations tightening just enough to exclude her. She was dressed well, composed, undeniably present, yet no one reached for her attention. She didn't chase it either. That was the mistake. Clara understood power dynamics better than most people assumed. She had spent years adjacent to wealth without belonging to it, close enough to recognize how it operated, distant enough to see its blind spots. Tonight she was one of them. She stood calmly, hands relaxed at her sides, posture steady. No phone. No drink. No nervous movement. Just quiet awareness. She watched the room as if she were studying it, not hoping it would notice her. Julian noticed that. He paused near the entrance longer than protocol required. A few men acknowledged him immediately. Others waited. No one rushed him. They never did. He gave minimal responses, his gaze drifting back to the woman no one had claimed. Clara felt the shift before she understood it. Not silence. Not stillness. Just a subtle redirection, like gravity adjusting. She lifted her eyes and met his across the room. Julian Cross didn't look curious. He looked deliberate. There was no smile, no softening. Just focus. The kind that made people uncomfortable because it wasn't asking for anything. It was deciding. Clara had met powerful men before. Politicians. Executives. Men who filled rooms by demanding attention. Julian was different. He didn't lean forward. He didn't scan for approval. The room adapted to him, not the other way around. Their eye contact lasted a moment longer than politeness allowed. Clara didn't look away. That interested him more than it should have. Julian accepted a glass from a server without thinking. He didn't drink. His mind was already reorganizing priorities. He had come to reinforce alliances, maintain visibility, remind certain people of obligations. None of that required urgency. Whatever Clara Whitmore was doing, standing alone, unclaimed, unaffected, it disrupted the rhythm of the room. And Julian didn't ignore disruptions. He studied them. Clara's heartbeat had changed. Not racing. Slowing. Her awareness sharpened, her body subtly adjusting as if preparing for impact. She told herself not to assign meaning to the attention. Men like him noticed anomalies all the time. It didn't mean she mattered. Still, she felt the difference. Julian turned away first, moving deeper into the reception. The path cleared instinctively. Men angled their bodies toward him. Conversations adjusted to include him. He acknowledged people efficiently, offering just enough to maintain equilibrium. But his attention didn't leave her. Clara watched him integrate seamlessly into the center of the room, watched how easily space bent around him. She could have left then. That would have been sensible. That would have preserved the illusion that this night hadn't touched her. She stayed. She stayed because, for the first time since arriving, something had shifted. The room no longer felt closed. Just unsettled. Julian finished one conversation, then another. His patience was intact. His expression unchanged. He glanced once more toward the edge of the room. Clara was still there. Still composed. Still alone. And now, unmistakably noticed, the night had made its first mistake. Clara Whitmore leaned against the side of the room, glass untouched, and let her eyes drift across the crowd. The laughter, the conversations, the clinking of glasses, it all existed in a layer above her. People moved through the reception like fish in a current, never noticing the solitary figure at the edges. She was visible enough to exist but irrelevant enough to be forgotten. The realization that she had become invisible didn't hurt, it was familiar. She had long since learned the difference between being ignored and being unwelcome. This was not indifference, it was polite disregard. The kind that allowed the powerful to move without acknowledging those they deemed non-essential. She had watched it happen countless times in her life. Eyes passing over, nods withheld, smiles reserved for others. Clara sipped the air more than her drink, listening to snippets of conversation she couldn't follow but understood nonetheless. Investors discussing markets in Asia. Mentions of mergers that would change entire neighborhoods. Women laughing at jokes she didn't hear, men responding with shallow amusement, all performance. She did not belong here, and yet she was learning everything she needed to know just by watching. A few people glanced her way briefly before moving on. None paused. None approached. She imagined herself as part of the decor, a human column that happened to be dressed in black silk rather than carved stone. It was easier this way, less risk, less expectation. She could study the room, the people, the way power operated without being drawn into the current. And then there was Julian. He had disappeared into the center of the room, but his presence lingered. Even from her distance she felt it like gravity. There was something magnetic about the way he moved through the crowd, not flashy, not aggressive, but inescapable. People adjusted themselves subtly when he passed, conversations paused, heads turned, not out of respect but recognition. Clara had learned early in life that some people existed in a category that could not be ignored, and Julian Cross belonged to it. The difference between him and everyone else here was that he didn't demand attention. He simply caused it. She was suddenly aware of how alone she felt. Not in the sense of being unloved or friendless, but alone in a room where influence dictated action and she had none. No one was coming to her, no one was watching her, no one wanted anything from her. It was a sharp contrast to the room's constant movement, a vacuum that centered on her without need. Her mind wandered briefly, curiosity, self-analysis, caution. But Clara had already mastered the habit of observing without reacting. She understood how to navigate spaces where she had no power. She could exist without demanding presence, could move through a crowd unnoticed, could appear harmless, irrelevant, or simply invisible. This skill had served her for years and it was doing so now. Yet she couldn't ignore the sensation of being singled out. Not by the crowd, not by anyone speaking, but by the subtle awareness that some force had noted her existence and made a mental calculation. Julian Cross had looked at her once, and the impact of that glance reverberated in her chest. He hadn't smiled, hadn't introduced himself, hadn't lingered. He had simply acknowledged her. That alone was enough to unsettle her. Her gaze returned to the periphery, scanning the room with the practiced detachment of someone accustomed to being overlooked. She observed the small hierarchies, the quiet exchanges of influence, the unspoken rules that governed who moved and who stayed put. Her eyes caught a man adjusting the cuff of his jacket as if to signal authority. A woman tilted her head, listening, not talking. Each gesture was coded. Each interaction was calculated. And she, standing slightly apart, was not part of it. She tried to make herself small, not in posture but in presence. A single step toward the wall, a slight lowering of her shoulders, a careful positioning of her hands. It was instinctive. She had learned long ago that occupying the wrong space, even briefly, could provoke discomfort or confrontation. Here she was safe, ignored, invisible, unremarkable. Yet, despite all her careful positioning, she felt the pull of attention again. A subtle movement across the room, a presence that the edges of her awareness couldn't fully define. Someone had chosen to notice, and it changed everything in ways she couldn't yet articulate. Clara shifted her weight, letting one foot cross lightly over the other, adjusting herself not because anyone cared but because it grounded her. She was aware, sharply, of the quiet isolation that had defined her evening. No interruptions, no engagement, no assumptions of her existence. Just the room, the air, and the faint pulse of anticipation she didn't yet understand. And through it all, Julian Cross's presence remained a low hum at the back of her awareness. Not visible now but undeniably there. A constant, controlled influence that contrasted sharply with the rest of the reception. He had entered the room, acknowledged her once, and disappeared, yet she could not shake the feeling that the night had already begun to bend around him. Alone. Unnoticed. Yet paradoxically not untouched. Clara Whitmore's eyes never left the crowd, but her attention had narrowed. She was no longer just standing on the edge of the room, she was studying it, analyzing patterns, decoding signals. The way people grouped, the subtle hierarchy of who moved toward whom, who leaned in when a word was spoken, who lingered without being noticed. Everything revealed intentions, status, and the unspoken language of wealth. She noticed Julian Cross again, though he wasn't trying to be noticed. He had taken a place near the center, hands loosely holding a glass, speaking to a few key individuals, but always lightly, efficiently, as though he had more important things to attend to. The room responded to him without any overt show. People angled their bodies toward him, whispered just low enough to be discreet, and yet the effect was unmistakable. He didn't command attention. He reshaped it. Clara allowed herself a small breath, recognizing the pull he exerted without even realizing it. Something about his presence made the rest of the crowd seem slightly irrelevant. She couldn't explain it, he hadn't approached her yet, but the observation alone made her pulse quicken in ways she had not expected. Not excitement. Not fear. A combination of alertness and curiosity that felt dangerous. Her gaze wandered back to the room, noting the small details she had missed before. The way a woman adjusted her hair at the exact moment someone powerful passed. The man in the corner checking his watch repeatedly, subtly signaling impatience. The slight hesitation in a conversation when Julian nodded, polite acknowledgement that carried weight far beyond the words exchanged. Clara catalogued it all, mentally drawing maps of influence and behavior. She realized she had done this kind of observation her whole life. Not here, not in spaces like this, but in situations where being overlooked could be both a survival skill and a weapon. She had learned to remain unnoticed while collecting information, reading faces, detecting intentions, sensing the energy in the room before acting. Tonight it was the same. She was invisible, yes, but she was far from powerless. Julian's eyes swept across the room periodically, and each time they landed on her, she felt the subtle tightening of her chest. He wasn't staring. He wasn't judging. He was assessing, measuring, acknowledging her presence in a way the rest of the room never would. His attention carried gravity. It was magnetic, deliberate, controlled. And though she fought the pull, she felt it. She allowed herself to observe him in return. His movements were economical, efficient, deliberate. A tilt of the head here, a slight pause in conversation there. The faint curve of his lips when a joke landed lightly. He was aware of every nuance of the room, and yet, despite the skill, his glance had found her and returned to her repeatedly. Clara studied how he held himself, the confidence in his posture, the calm precision in the way he moved. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. It was power distilled and refined. She felt a subtle tension in her own body as she realized she was analyzing him the same way he had measured her. For the first time in the evening, she noticed the reactions of others when he looked her way. Brief shifts in body language, tiny adjustments in stance, unspoken recognition that something significant had shifted. The room didn't know it yet, but she did. Attention had started to orbit around her, guided by his presence. She didn't move closer. She didn't act. She only observed. And Julian, in turn, continued to notice every nuance of her stillness, the quiet control in her posture, the way she didn't seek him out but didn't shy away either. He was intrigued, not by her beauty alone though she had it, but by her composure, her independence, the subtle awareness that made her both accessible and untouchable. It was a dangerous combination. Clara realized that she had been holding herself in check all evening, carefully navigating the space where she had no real standing. But now, under his gaze, the isolation didn't feel protective. It felt like preparation. The crowd could ignore her all it wanted, but she understood instinctively that Julian Cross would not. And in that understanding, the night quietly shifted. She had been unseen for too long. Now she was being watched. And she could feel, in the faint tightening of her pulse and the shallow awareness of her breathing, that everything about the rest of the evening would hinge on this observation. Hers and his. Nothing had happened yet. No words. No contact. No formal acknowledgement. Yet the dynamic had already changed. Clara's isolation had been broken, not by proximity, not by conversation, but by attention. The kind of attention that made her question what she had thought she knew about herself, about power, and about the rules of a room that she didn't belong to. And the truth of it, quiet and undeniable, was that she liked it. Julian Cross didn't enter rooms. He arrived and the space responded. Tonight, the reception had already hummed with muted conversation, the low murmur of power moving discreetly among its players. But as he stepped through the doorway, the atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly. Heads tilted, shoulders straightened, and subtle pauses occurred in conversations that had seemed too important to interrupt. The crowd hadn't noticed him yet, but the energy, sharp, controlled, undeniable, announced his presence before he even reached the center. Clara Whitmore was the first to register it. She had been observing the crowd, cataloging behaviors, tracing influence, and noting the invisible currents of status. But Julian's arrival cut through all of it. His movement wasn't loud. It wasn't ostentatious. It was measured, deliberate. One foot in front of the other, jacket settled neatly over his frame, hands relaxed, eyes scanning. Every action conveyed certainty, a quiet dominance that didn't need validation. Her pulse picked up slightly, not out of fear but recognition. She knew him the way someone might recognize a predator in slow, confident motion. Not because of threat but because the room itself began to realign. People shifted unconsciously around him, carving space without knowing why, and she understood instantly that he wasn't just powerful. He was influential in a way that made her own invisibility feel almost fragile. Julian's gaze moved smoothly through the crowd. He acknowledged acquaintances with slight nods, a half smile, a word whispered in passing. But even in his engagement, there was a controlled restraint, every interaction efficient, intentional. Nothing wasted. Everything measured. And then his eyes found her. It was no accident. She was still at the edge of the reception, as unclaimed and composed as she had been for the past hour. The shift in his attention was subtle but undeniable. People who had been speaking briefly paused, unconsciously aware that the room's focus had redirected. Clara felt it like a pulse, a low, steady pressure that drew her attention before she even consciously acknowledged him. He walked toward her, slow enough to observe, fast enough to assert authority. Julian didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He moved as if he already owned the space, even though no one had handed it to him. Each step was deliberate, measured, exuding control without aggression. Clara Whitmore adjusted her posture almost imperceptibly. She had been comfortable in her stillness before, unnoticed, unclaimed. Now she was being observed in a way that demanded acknowledgement. The sensation was new. It was thrilling, dangerous, and unexpectedly it was appealing. When he stopped a few feet from her, the crowd subtly parted without direction. No one spoke. No one touched him. The separation was complete. He didn't reach out immediately, didn't smile or speak, but the space around them seemed charged, taut, as though the very air had been altered by his presence. Clara's instincts flared, the familiar calm edge sharpening. She recognized power when it walked toward her, recognized confidence that didn't need permission. Julian Cross didn't announce himself. He didn't dominate the room with voice or presence. He simply existed in such a way that the room adjusted naturally around him, and she, despite her usual composure, felt it deeply. He looked at her steadily, not curious, not amused, not flattering. He assessed. He considered. He measured. Julian's gaze wasn't an invitation. It wasn't polite. It was a statement. He had noticed her. And in that moment, the isolation Clara had cultivated for herself no longer existed. She could have turned away, pretended she hadn't felt the pull of his attention, walked toward the safety of anonymity at the back of the room. But she didn't. He took the final step and stood directly before her, close enough that she could feel the faint heat of presence, yet distant enough to preserve control. Julian Cross didn't speak immediately. There was no need. Silence carried authority and he wielded it expertly. The subtle pause, the measured proximity, the weight of his attention, it all demanded a reaction. Clara Whitmore inhaled slightly, not because she was afraid, but because the recognition that she was now visible to him, and only him, sent a thrill through her that she had not anticipated. Then Julian spoke, his voice low, calm, deliberate. "Dance with me." 2 words. No elaboration. No charm. No pretense. Commanded, not requested. The weight behind them was unmistakable. The room around them continued in low hum, oblivious, but the air between them shifted in a way that Clara could not ignore. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the dance floor. No music had started. No one was moving in anticipation. And yet, the moment felt inevitable. Julian's presence had claimed it before anyone else had even realized it existed. Clara tilted her head slightly, measuring him. The subtle power in his posture, the precision of his words, the way the space had bent around him, it was rare, dangerous, irresistible. And she found herself compelled, despite her instincts. She took a small step forward. The first act of acknowledgement. And in that small movement, the night, her isolation, and the unspoken rules of the room began to unravel. Julian Cross watched, controlled and deliberate as she closed the distance. Not a word more was necessary. He had arrived. She had noticed. And now the game between them, the tension, the unspoken rules, the magnetism, had truly begun. Clara Whitmore had always been careful. She knew how to move through rooms unnoticed, how to measure her presence so it would neither attract attention nor invite scrutiny. But tonight that skill had failed. Not because she had misjudged the room, not because she had faltered in her composure, but because someone had chosen to notice her. Julian Cross. Even from a distance, even with a room full of people, he had singled her out. And the moment she realized it, Clara felt a subtle shift in the rhythm of the evening. Every small sound, the clink of glass, the low laughter, the shuffle of conversation, seemed to pivot around them. Not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. He had marked her, and the room had responded. She tried to mask it, taking a slow breath, adjusting her posture with the same precision that had kept her invisible for years. Yet the sensation of being observed, truly observed, sent a ripple through her. She wasn't just visible, she was under scrutiny, measured, assessed. And for the first time that evening she felt a rush of curiosity, about him, about herself, about the unspoken rules that had suddenly shifted. Julian stood a few feet away, composed as ever, his gaze deliberate. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone communicated intention, and Clara felt it in the taut line of her shoulders, in the subtle quickening of her pulse. The room had stopped being neutral. She could see it in the eyes that flitted toward him, the subtle pauses in conversation, the half-smiles of recognition from those who understood what his focus meant. No one else could have done this. Not with subtlety, not with authority. Julian didn't command attention. He didn't ask for it. He redirected it. And she, standing slightly apart, had become the axis of that redirection. Clara's instincts flared. She scanned the room quickly, not to escape, not to hide, but to see if anyone else had noticed the shift. Faces flickered, expressions adjusted, but no one approached. They all waited, unconsciously aware of the magnetic pull he had created. In a space designed to isolate and elevate, she had become the center without ever asking for it. Her gaze met his again. This time longer. A slow, deliberate contact that demanded acknowledgement. She couldn't look away, though every instinct urged caution. There was no invitation, no challenge, only recognition. A declaration that she existed in a way the rest of the room had not permitted. She swallowed softly, aware of the subtle heat rising along the back of her neck. Julian Cross had not smiled, had not moved closer, had not spoken. Yet the intensity of his presence, the unspoken claim he made with a glance, was enough to unsettle her carefully maintained calm. She felt both exposed and intrigued, a combination that had a dangerous edge. Clara allowed herself to observe him in turn. Julian's posture was perfect, relaxed but precise, casual but in control. He didn't shift nervously, didn't glance around for validation, didn't require affirmation from anyone in the room. Every action was measured, intentional, controlled. And in the midst of all that control, he had chosen her. It was a power play, quiet and deliberate. He had announced it with nothing but presence and eye contact, yet the message was unmistakable. She had been noticed. She had been singled out. And she understood, with a mix of anticipation and tension, that nothing would ever be the same for the rest of the evening. Clara's body reacted before her mind could fully process it. Her breathing was steady, but the subtle rise and fall of her chest was more pronounced than usual. Her hands itched to move, not in nervousness but in readiness, ready for whatever he intended, aware that in this room with this man, every small gesture mattered. She felt the first spark of exhilaration, tempered by caution. To be seen by Julian Cross was to step into a game she did not yet understand, a game of power, control, and subtle seduction. She was not afraid, not exactly. She was alert, attuned, and acutely aware of the shift that had taken place. Across the room, Julian studied her just as carefully. He noted the way she held herself, the faint tightening of her muscles, the alert awareness in her eyes. He observed her without intrusion, measured without pressure, and allowed her presence to unfold naturally. He didn't speak, he didn't step closer, but he didn't need to. The recognition alone had initiated a quiet, inevitable pull between them. The crowd moved around them, conversations resumed, music continued, but their orbit had changed. Julian Cross had marked her, and Clara Whitmore knew it. The isolation she had clung to since her arrival had ended, and for the first time in her life she welcomed it. Julian Cross had made his choice the moment he saw her standing alone. The room could swirl with politics, power plays, and subtle maneuvering, but Clara Whitmore's presence cut through all of it. She wasn't loud, flashy, or demanding. She didn't compete. She merely existed, and that had caught his attention in a way that nothing else in the room had. He walked toward her with the certainty of someone accustomed to having the final word in every situation. Not a rush, not a gesture of arrogance, just measured steps, confidence in each movement, and an awareness that the world around them would adjust naturally. Clara noticed him immediately. Her instincts, honed over years of navigating spaces where she had no power, sharpened in response. She had been observed, studied, and now the observer was closing the distance. The subtle shift of tension in the room became almost palpable. Conversations softened, glasses paused mid-lift, a few heads tilted in curiosity. They sensed the invisible thread connecting them. Julian stopped a short distance away, close enough that Clara could feel the faint pressure of presence, yet far enough to preserve control. His eyes held hers, unwavering, calculating. He was not asking. He was deciding. And that decision, expressed through posture, intention, and the quiet authority of someone who was always in command, was unmistakable. "Dance with me," he said, voice low, even deliberate. 2 words, and yet they carried weight far beyond their simplicity. The room continued its quiet hum, but the air between them stiffened, charged with a tension neither had yet defined. Clara's first instinct was to hesitate. She weighed the invitation, socially, physically, mentally. This wasn't a polite request. It wasn't a test. It was an assertion. And with Julian Cross, an assertion was never casual. She shifted slightly, tilting her head, assessing him. The space he occupied was controlled, commanding, yet not threatening. It drew her in even as it demanded composure. Her pulse quickened, not out of fear but anticipation. She had felt power before, had been in rooms filled with influence and dominance, but this felt different. Calculated. Magnetic. Her body reacted almost involuntarily, a subtle tightening along her spine, the faint stir of warmth that accompanied a tension she couldn't ignore. She understood instinctively that this wasn't just about a dance. It was about acknowledgement. Recognition. The first move in a quiet, unspoken game of influence and control. Clara's hands itched, not for the glass she held, but for the opportunity to step into the orbit of someone who could shift a room simply by moving through it. Her lips pressed together in a faint line. She wasn't afraid. She was aware. Alert. Present. She finally nodded, almost imperceptibly, a small acknowledgement that she had understood the gravity of the invitation. Julian's lips curved into the faintest, controlled expression. No smile, no charm, just satisfaction. His decision had been made. Her response had confirmed it. As they moved toward the center of the room, the crowd subtly parted. Conversations continued, but their movement had shifted the rhythm of the evening. People glanced, whispers followed, and yet no one intervened. Julian's presence had made it clear. She was his focus, his choice. Clara's steps were deliberate. Each one measured, graceful, confident. She felt the faint thrill of being visible in a space that had ignored her for so long. There was power in this moment, not hers alone, but theirs together, shared in silence and intent. Julian extended his hand, formal yet intimate. Clara placed hers lightly in his, acknowledging the connection, feeling the warmth of controlled strength in his grasp. The motion was subtle, not boastful, but it carried authority. The dance floor, previously empty, now existed for them. Music had begun softly, but it was secondary to the tension that pulsed between them. Julian guided her with minimal effort, the smallest shift of weight, a gentle pivot. She matched it instinctively, aware of the magnetism, the authority, the deliberate control that radiated from him. They moved in quiet synchronization, neither speaking, yet both communicating everything necessary. The world beyond them existed, but it had faded into background noise. In that shared space, Clara realized that isolation could be undone, not by the crowd, not by conversation, but by deliberate recognition. Julian's gaze never wavered. Clara responded in kind, aware that each movement, each subtle shift of posture, was part of an unspoken dialogue. The dance was more than movement. It was acknowledgement. It was negotiation. It was power in motion. And as the music carried them forward, Clara understood one thing with absolute clarity. She had been noticed, she had been chosen, and the decision was irrevocable. For the first time that evening, she felt the thrilling edge of being truly seen. The room had noticed, though it hadn't fully realized it yet. Julian Cross and Clara Whitmore moved toward the center of the reception, subtle authority guiding each step. Conversations hummed, glasses clinked, and laughter continued, but something shifted beneath the surface, a quiet awareness that demanded attention. The crowd responded instinctively, glancing, whispering, repositioning themselves without being aware of why. Julian didn't speak. He didn't need to. The energy he radiated, calm, controlled, deliberate, was enough to carve a path through the crowd. His hand in hers was firm but measured, communicating possession without arrogance. It wasn't a show of dominance for the room, it was a statement, quiet yet undeniable. She was his focus and the rest could adjust accordingly. Clara felt the subtle change immediately. Eyes flicked toward them, brief acknowledgments of the shift that had taken place. Not everyone understood it, but they recognized it instinctively. Julian Cross didn't introduce her. He didn't claim her aloud. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence, the deliberate attention he had invested, had done the work for him. Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from awareness. She was visible now, undeniably, and yet she wasn't exposed. Julian had created a boundary around them, a private sphere in a crowded room, and she instinctively adjusted, letting herself occupy it without hesitation. The thrill of attention mingled with the comfort of control. His control, yes, but calibrated perfectly to her presence. The whispers began almost imperceptibly at first. A head turned here, a subtle murmur there, the faint brush of curiosity that followed two people who moved with quiet dominance. Some guests caught the intentionality in Julian's gaze, the way he didn't allow anyone else to intrude upon their space. Others sensed it instinctively, feeling the magnetic pull without understanding the source. Clara noticed the reactions, cataloging them in the same way she had observed the room earlier. Subtle adjustments in posture, the fleeting glance of recognition, the tiny ripple of tension spreading across groups. She felt the delicate balance of influence in motion, the invisible currents of power she had long studied. And now she was a participant, not a spectator. Julian led her onto a small, open section of the floor, just enough for movement, just enough to be seen. The music carried softly but clearly, a rhythm that had no impact on the tension between them. Their dance wasn't about the steps, it was about the presence, the silent acknowledgement that the room had shifted. Her hand in his was steady. His other hand rested lightly on her back, guiding without force. Neither needed words. Every motion, every subtle pivot communicated the truth. She was noticed. She was chosen. And the world around them had to recognize it. Clara tilted her head slightly, allowing her gaze to meet his. Julian didn't break eye contact. Not once. His calm, controlled stare was enough to quiet the space around them further. It wasn't a gaze of flirtation nor of casual intrigue. It was a deliberate, measured acknowledgement of her presence, a claim without announcement. The room might not have understood, but she did. People began to react more openly, subtle but deliberate. A few men paused mid-conversation, assessing the dynamic. Women adjusted subtly, noting how his attention had altered her visibility. Some whispered, faint smiles crossing faces. Others merely observed, understanding that the room had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. Julian's claim over her was quiet, unspoken, yet unmistakable to anyone attuned to power. Clara allowed herself to feel it fully. The thrill of being recognized, of being acknowledged so deliberately by someone like Julian Cross, was intoxicating. She didn't move differently, didn't try to impress. She simply existed in the moment, matching his deliberate energy with her composed awareness. The tension between them was almost tangible, the subtle brush of influence as electrifying as the contact of skin against skin, the heat of proximity, the quiet acknowledgement of power. By the time the music shifted, the crowd had settled into the orbit of their silent claim. Julian didn't speak, didn't announce, didn't flaunt. He simply existed, and the room had adjusted to him, and to her. Clara understood that this was more than a dance. It was recognition. It was a statement, a declaration that she was no longer invisible. And it was deliberate, controlled, and undeniable. As Julian guided her through the measured steps, subtle yet precise, Clara realized that she had crossed a threshold. The isolation of earlier had ended. She had been noticed, she had been chosen, and the public acknowledgement, silent yet palpable, had begun to define the night. The room had shifted, though most of its occupants hadn't yet realized how. Conversations hummed again, but a subtle awareness hung in the air, a quiet tension that couldn't be ignored. Julian Cross and Clara Whitmore had become the axis of attention, not through spectacle or dramatics, but through presence, poise, and the unspoken authority that emanated from him. Eyes flicked toward them, sometimes deliberately, sometimes unconsciously. Men noted the alignment of power, women noted the assertion of influence and confidence. Whispers traveled like soft currents, curious and speculative, though no one dared interrupt. Julian didn't need validation. He didn't need approval. His choice, his attention, had created a ripple that even the most composed of guests recognized. Clara felt it immediately. The energy around her shifted in waves, subtle but insistent. Heads turned, a few eyebrows lifted, some faces softened with curiosity, others hardened with faint jealousy. The room reacted without any overt announcement, without explicit words. Its response was instinctive, governed by the invisible rules of influence and hierarchy. And she, at the center of it, absorbed it all. She adjusted her posture subtly, not out of self-consciousness but awareness. She felt the heat of attention, the quiet observation of every movement, and the subtle impact of being the focus of someone like Julian Cross. Her pulse was steady, controlled, but beneath that control, there was a spark, an unspoken thrill, a recognition that she had crossed an invisible line. She had been noticed, chosen. And it was intoxicating. Julian's gaze never wavered. He studied her as carefully as she studied him, measuring her reactions, assessing the way she responded to the crowd, to the room, to him. His presence was quiet but dominant, like a weight pressing against the edges of perception, drawing her into alignment without words. Clara felt a tension coil in her chest, not from fear but from awareness. She understood that power could be quiet, subtle, and precise, and that the most dangerous forms often left no room for overt gestures. Julian's influence was like that, measured, controlled, magnetic. And she, standing tall in response, was not just complying, she was participating. The room continued to respond. Guests whispered quietly, noting her composure, the way she didn't break under the invisible claim of his attention. A few glanced at Julian with mild curiosity, recognizing his deliberate focus on her. Others, less attuned, simply sensed the shift and adjusted subconsciously. Conversations slowed. Eyes lingered. Social energy recalibrated around a single axis, and she was at the center. Clara's mind raced, quietly, deliberately. She felt the pull of attraction, yes, but tempered with awareness. This wasn't infatuation. This was recognition of power, influence, and precision, the magnetic force of a man who didn't need to flaunt dominance because it existed in every measured step he took. She had been observed, chosen. And the subtle thrill of it was undeniable. Julian's hand rested lightly on hers as they moved in the dance, but his touch was calculated, precise, conveying control without pressure, intimacy without intrusion. The room seemed to dim around them, though no lights had changed. They existed in a space of shared awareness, where the world's reaction amplified rather than diminished their connection. Clara's breath was steady, but her body registered the heat of attention, the quiet electricity of being singled out. The subtle friction of proximity, the controlled pressure of his hand, the deliberate cadence of their movement, it all sent ripples through her that she hadn't anticipated. And yet she didn't pull away. She matched his precision, moving with awareness, letting the dance speak for them both. She realized fully that she had never experienced attention like this. Not the shallow admiration of strangers. Not the polite curiosity of peers. This was deliberate, precise, and unyielding. He had chosen her, and the crowd, whether they understood it or not, was forced to acknowledge it. Julian's gaze shifted briefly, just enough for her to notice, and she understood the subtle communication in his eyes. He wasn't commanding her. He wasn't demanding obedience. He was observing, testing, asserting without intrusion, and inviting her into a game that required awareness, composure, and intuition. Clara felt her body respond in kind, slightly, almost imperceptibly. The heat of attention mingled with her awareness of control. She was being watched, assessed, acknowledged, and for the first time in the evening she embraced it fully. The isolation that had defined her arrival was gone, replaced by something charged, deliberate, and profoundly captivating. The room might never understand it, but Clara did. She was no longer invisible. She had been noticed. She had been claimed, subtly but unmistakably. And the reaction of everyone else, quiet, perceptive, instinctive, only confirmed it. In that moment, standing in the soft pulse of the music, surrounded by whispers and subtle glances, Clara Whitmore realized something thrilling. She had crossed into a space where recognition and desire were dictated not by the crowd, but by him, and she was ready to follow. The music played softly, almost as if the room itself had adapted to the rhythm of their attention. Julian Cross didn't dance to entertain. He moved with precision, with intent, every motion measured, every subtle shift and weight deliberate. And Clara Whitmore matched him, not copying, not yielding, but participating fully, aware of every nuance, every unspoken command between them. By now the crowd had noticed the transformation. It was no longer just that he had singled her out, it was that she had responded. The subtle balance of dominance and acknowledgement had shifted, and the room sensed it. Conversations had quieted near them. Heads turned involuntarily. Eyes lingered longer. The whispers were soft, discreet, yet unmistakable. Something had changed, and it wasn't just the music. Clara felt it too. There was a magnetic pull between them, subtle and controlled, that had nothing to do with the dance steps themselves. It was a quiet tug of influence, power, and awareness. A connection formed without words but articulated through the smallest gestures. Julian's hand on her back, light but unwavering, guided her, yet never imposed. Each pivot, each movement carried intent. She realized something then, clearly and without hesitation. This was no ordinary evening. The isolation she had arrived with had evaporated. Attention, focus, and control had shifted entirely. And in that shift, she had a voice, a presence, an agency she hadn't expected. Julian's power was immense, but he wasn't demanding submission. He was offering challenge, acknowledgement, and a subtle invitation to engage. Clara straightened slightly, lifted her chin, and let her gaze meet his fully. There was no fear, no hesitation, only awareness and the faintest trace of defiance. Julian registered it immediately. It wasn't resistance, not in the confrontational sense, but an understanding that she was neither passive nor naive. She was alert, present, and deliberately participating in the exchange of influence. The room reacted again. This time more perceptibly. A few men paused mid-conversation, a few women tilted their heads, all sensing the silent recalibration of power. Julian's subtle dominance was clear to those attuned to presence. Clara's composure amplified it. Together they formed a dynamic that could not be ignored, a quiet force that shifted the social gravity of the reception without spectacle or noise. Clara felt warmth rise along the back of her neck, along her arms, even through the careful control she maintained over her posture. It was the thrill of recognition, not flattery, not admiration, but acknowledgement of presence, awareness, and subtle influence. Julian had noticed her, she had responded, the balance had shifted. He leaned just slightly, enough for her to feel the faint pressure of his movement, and she mirrored it, matching the intensity with her own controlled energy. The smallest gestures, tilt of the head, subtle shift of weight, the slight alignment of their shoulders, became a conversation of unspoken signals. They were no longer just a man and a woman on a dance floor. They were two forces, testing boundaries, negotiating influence, and acknowledging the power each held. The crowd continued to react, unconsciously or deliberately. The whispers became more frequent, subtle smiles and glances exchanged. People noticed, but they didn't understand the mechanics of the exchange. Julian's presence had always commanded attention, but Clara's response had amplified it. The invisible boundary he had created earlier now included her, and she navigated it with elegance and awareness that surprised even him. Julian's eyes lingered on her in a way that was both measured and intent. He observed the subtle movements of her hands, the slight tension in her posture, the way her breath remained controlled even as the heat of attention and proximity intensified. And he adjusted accordingly, never breaking the delicate balance, guiding her without forcing, commanding without demanding. Clara felt the power shift fully within her. She wasn't merely the observed anymore, she was an active participant. The equilibrium between them had changed. She understood, instinctively, that influence wasn't just about command, it was about presence, awareness, and the careful negotiation of subtle signals. And she matched him perfectly. By the time the music shifted into a slower, deeper rhythm, the room's attention had crystallized around them. Julian Cross and Clara Whitmore had become the unspoken center of gravity, not through flamboyance or announcement, but through sheer presence and deliberate action. The balance had shifted, quietly, and the effect was electrifying. For Clara it was exhilarating. For Julian it was satisfying. For the room it was unavoidable. Power had found its equilibrium, and it pulsed, quietly but undeniably, between them. The music faded, the soft rhythm of the evening slowing to a gentle hum. Julian Cross and Clara Whitmore paused at the center of the reception, their steps settling into stillness, their hands lingering, neither willing to release the quiet tension that had defined the last few minutes. Around them, the room exhaled, as if finally acknowledging the subtle storm that had passed unnoticed by most but felt by all who had the awareness to sense it. Clara drew in a slow, measured breath, letting the heat that had been building settle into her chest. The thrill of attention, of being chosen and acknowledged, still pulsed beneath her calm exterior. She had moved through countless rooms, navigated countless social landscapes, and yet tonight had been unlike any other. She had been seen, not just by a man of immense power, but by someone who understood the subtle dynamics of observation, influence, and control. Julian's hand remained lightly on hers, a faint pressure that conveyed authority without intrusion. He didn't smile, didn't speak, and yet the weight of his presence said everything necessary. The room had been theirs for a moment, a private orbit in a public space, and both of them had navigated it with awareness, poise, and deliberate intention. Clara's eyes swept over the crowd, noting reactions without judgment. Some guests looked away quickly, sensing they had intruded upon a private moment. Others whispered softly, curiosity laced with envy or admiration. Few could articulate what had occurred. Fewer still could recognize the quiet negotiation of power that had played out before them. But Clara didn't need their understanding. She had experienced it firsthand. She shifted her weight slightly, breaking the silent tension, and Julian's gaze followed, unflinching. There was no rush, no dramatics, only the deliberate awareness that had defined their dance from the start. The crowd might perceive a dance of movement and music, but Clara understood it as something far more significant: acknowledgement, influence, and the unspoken connection forged through observation and choice. The room had resumed its rhythm, conversations bubbling gently around them, but the after-effect lingered. Julian released her hand finally, but the subtle energy between them did not dissipate. It remained, a quiet charge that hovered, unspoken but undeniable. Clara felt it in the faint warmth that lingered along her arm, in the subtle pull of awareness she could not ignore. She turned her attention inward, reflecting on what had just transpired. She had come to this event expecting to be invisible, prepared to watch rather than participate. And yet, the evening had shifted irrevocably the moment Julian Cross had chosen to notice her. She had responded, not with submission but with awareness and poise. In doing so, she had claimed her own presence, asserting herself in a subtle dance of power that had left both of them, Julian and her, changed. Her mind replayed each detail: the way he had entered, the precise measure of his gaze, the deliberate extension of his hand, the unspoken communication in their steps. She recognized now the power of presence, the thrill of acknowledgement, and the intoxicating weight of subtle influence. Julian's effect lingered. Even now, standing slightly apart, moving through the softened hum of the room, she felt the imprint of his attention. It was not just a memory, it was a charge, a deliberate force that demanded recognition. And in that acknowledgement, Clara understood something essential. This was not the end of their interaction. It was merely the beginning. The crowd moved around them, conversations rising and falling, glasses refilled, laughter renewed. Yet, for Clara, the evening had narrowed to a single truth: she had been seen. She had been chosen. She had been claimed, not in possession, not in spectacle, but in the quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of a man whose influence extended far beyond the room. Julian's gaze found hers once more across the distance. No words were spoken, no gestures required. The subtle tension, the quiet energy, the shared understanding lingered in the space between them. Clara Whitmore felt it fully, aware that the night, and perhaps much more beyond it, had shifted irrevocably. As she adjusted her posture, smoothing the silk of her dress and releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, she smiled faintly to herself. She had survived the scrutiny, matched the power, and emerged unshaken. The evening had tested her, challenged her composure, and revealed a thrill she had not anticipated, but one she was now unwilling to relinquish. Julian Cross had departed, blending back into the currents of the room, but his effect remained. It hovered in her awareness, in the subtle rise of adrenaline, in the quiet thrill that pulsed beneath her skin. And Clara Whitmore understood, with a certainty that both thrilled and unsettled her, that the night had ended for no one, least of all her. The after-effect was hers alone, a lingering tension, a charge of possibility, and a promise of encounters yet to come. And she welcomed it.